On this channel I tell stories from the Beattie Studio collection. John Watt Beattie and other photographers left behind an amazing collection of colonial and convict era photographs. G'day and welcome to Forgotten Tasmania. I'm John Stephenson. Let me show you some things about Tasmania that have been forgotten. While I was researching Franklin Square and Governor John Franklin and his wife Lady Jane Franklin, I came across the story of the capture of Martin Cash. This was being told by Reg Watson, local historian, at our history night at the tea rooms. And as soon as I heard the story and the tie-in with the Franklins, I immediately asked Reg if he'd tell that story for the Forgotten Tasmania audience, and he's agreed to do that. So here's what Reg had to say.
Well, John, the story of the capture of Bushranger Martin Cash is absolutely fascinating. It happened in August 1843, and Martin, after his bush career, had established himself on the summit of Mount Dromedary. Now, he was up there with two other comrades, Harry Kavanagh and George Jones, but he was also up there with Bessie Cash, whom he politely called Mrs. Cash. Well, in fact, they weren't married. They'd met each other when they were in New South Wales, and she came with Martin when he came what was then, of course, Van Diemen's Land. Now, the 51st King's Regiment were honing in on their fort. So it's considered a little bit more safe for Bessie to leave the fort and go and seek sanctuary in Hobart Town. So off went Bessie. Now Bessie is the nucleus of our story. So Bessie is in Hobart Town, leaving Martin and his gang back at Mount Dromedary. But he had a lot of informants, a lot of friends around the village or around the mountain at the base of it and Bridgewater, etc. And word came to him that Bessie Cash had been arrested. Now Martin was a red-headed, fiery Irishman, and this perturbed him to no end. So someone wrote the note for him because he was illiterate. So he wrote a note to the then governor, Sir John Franklin. It was a very well-written note, but essentially the note said to Sir John, if you do not release Mrs. Cash, I am going to come down and give you a good thrashing. Now, this was Cash's letter to the then Governor of Tasmania. And of course, that was wonderful for the establishment because they did release Mrs. Cash, and Martin thought it was because of his threat to give him a good thrashing. Well, it wasn't. They released her to lure Martin in, but Martin fell for it. But what really happened, because it became a little bit more safe at the fort, they expected Bessie to return. Well, she didn't. Now, as I said, Martin had a lot of informants, and he was informed that his girlfriend, Bessie, had shacked up with a man called Joe Pratt in Murray Street, Hobart. Well, of course, this was no good news for Martin. So in his own journal, he said, I'm going into Hobart Town to do them both harm. So he left his fort, put 3 pistols in his belt, and came down from the mountain, crossed the Jordan River. He would have followed the River Duard through Gilson Bay, Lindisfarne, and he finally ended up at Bellarive, or Kangaroo Point. And he took shelter in the Bellarive Hotel, and he had a meal in the Bellarive Hotel, and he asked the publican, he said, do you know anyone who can row me across the river to Hobart Town? And the publican said, yes, I do actually. And he went away and he brought this chap back with a boy. And Martin said, well, look, how much will you charge? And the fellow said 3 and 6pence. Martin hummed and hard. He said, okay. Now, the 3 pistols that he had in his belt, he actually threw one away on his way to Bellarive. It wasn't working, so he was left with 2 single-shot pistols. So the boy and the man, whom we don't know who it is, was rowed him across the River Duart. Now, this is late afternoon, if you like, 29th of August 1843, so it's still in winter. And it's a long way from Bellareve across the River Duart rowing, and one surmises that they navigated their path by the dim lights of Hobart Town. Whether they got back safely, who knows, but anyway, they did deliver Martin at the Old Wharf. Now, Martin went up into Melville Street. This is Martin going to do Joe Pratt and Bessie harm. But in the meantime, he calls into the shop and he buys a hat, which I find a rather weird thing to do. And at the back of the shop lived a man whom he knew. His name is Cregan Hill, or short, Vinegar Hill. He was called Vinegar Hill because he partook in the 1804 rebellion in Castle Hill in New South Wales, which has subsequently become known as Vinegar Hill. So Vinegar Hill is making his re-friendship with Martin. Martin said, "Do you know where Joe Pratt lives?" And Vinegar Hill, or Cregan, said, "Well, I know just about where he lives, but not exactly." And Martin said, "Well, can you take me there?" He said, "Yes, I will take you there." And no doubt he would have said, "Well, what purpose?" And Martin would have told him, but nonetheless, Cregan Hill still accompanied Martin. And this Joe Pratt was living with Bessie in a laneway up from Murray Street that led into Harrington Street. So off they go. Martin looking for Joe Pratt, no doubt give him a good thrashing. Perhaps he's given up the idea of giving Sir John Franklin a good thrashing, and perhaps also giving Bessie a good thrashing, because he did say in his journal to do them harm, both. So they go up and into Murray Street, near the Bluebells Inn, which was located in Murray Street, and they didn't know exactly where Joe Pratt's house was. So they asked these two men who were lolling around. One was Robert Egar and the other one was Tom Thomas. Now these two men were ex-convicts, but they also had been recruited as constables. So they had been placed up there waiting to see Martin seek out Joe Pratt and Bessie. And lo and behold, he turns up. And one of them says, "You're Martin Cash." And of course the game was up. So Cregan Hill, he goes to the left, runs off, because they thought he was George Jones, the other bushranger. But their emphasis was on Martin, of course. So Cregan Hill runs off, and Martin starts to run. He runs down from Murray Street. Now one of the constables scream out, "It's Martin Cash, stop him." And he shoots at Martin Cash, but the bullet went, or the pellet went wide. So Martin turns into Melville Street. Now by this time, not only the two constables were after him, but several dozen other Tasmanians. Of course, there was a reward on Martin's head, 50 sovereigns. That's a lot of money. Now, to give you an idea the amount of money that it was, the average wage of a constable at that time was 10 bob, half a pound, less than half a sovereign. So Martin's screaming down Melville Street. Now his aim was to cross from Hobart into the bush on the Domain, get away from the pursuers, if you like. And as I said, there's several dozen now running after him. And Hobart was alive then. There was no shop limitation of hours, you know. So Martin was running down Melville Street, he crossed over to Elizabeth, and he crossed over into Argyle Street. Now, by this time, because Martin was a very good runner, and he was some yards in front of his pursuers. But then he didn't know at the time, Melville Street in 1843, and it was until the late 1950s, because I can remember it, was a dead end. Now, all the other streets, Bathurst Street, Collins Street, Liverpool Street, all those streets that run down that direction do lead to the Domain. There was one street that didn't, and that was Melville Street. At the end of Melville Street was a 3-storey prison barracks that was situated on Campbell Street. Now, that was still there when I was a boy. And it's a shame, actually, they ever pulled it down, because the tourist attraction it would be now would be absolutely enormous. And anyway, in about 1960, it was pulled down for the new jail at Risdon. And Martin realised his mistake. And ever since, it's become known as Martin's mistake. So Martin had to turn round. And he turned round, and by this time, the gang behind him had actually caught up to him. But they pulled out his pistols, so they made way for Martin. Now, he turned right into Argyle Street. Then he went into Brisbane Street. So he's running down Brisbane Street with this horde of people, which was probably 100 people, including the 2 constables, running after him. Now, at that time, there was the ye-old Commodore Inn, which is now the Brisbane Hotel. And inside the inn, it was run by Mrs. Mary Ann Smith and her son Ebenezer. Now, inside the inn was Peter Winstanley. Now, poor old Peter got caught up in it all. He was a constable, although an ex-convict, a constable off duty. He had been working down the prison in Campbell Street, and he was taking a quiet drink, and which was very tragic. He's the wrong place at the wrong time. So he was in the pub, and Mrs. Smith says, "Look, what's all that commotion outside? You better go and investigate." So poor old Peter comes out, and he sees all this horde of people, and people screaming out, "Martin Cash, Martin Cash." And Peter, being a constable, he puts up his hand and says, "Halt." Well, Martin had no intention of halting. So what Martin did, he shot Peter Stanley, and it went in his left breast, where the heart is located, and poor old Peter Stanley fell down, and he said to Mrs. Smith, "Oh, Mrs. Smith, I am shot, I'm a dead man." So by this time, Martin shooting Peter, everyone had got onto Martin. Martin, with his second pistol, shot that, it blew off the nose of a man called Oldfield, and the bullet ricocheted and knocked off a couple of fingers from a fellow called Cunliffe. But by that time, the mob was on him. And they brutalised him by kicking him and punching him. And the 2 constables were there at the time. They did exactly the same. And there's a woman in the crowd that screamed out, "Look, stop it, you're going to kill him. Be like a man and fight like men." And that really perhaps saved Martin Cash. But anyway, it was all over Martin Cash. He was handcuffed, and he was taken to the penitentiary in Campbell Street, where his wounds were looked after by 3 doctors. Now, poor old Peter Winstanley, the constable, he died 2 days later. He was taken into the Brisbane Hotel, or the Commodore Inn at the time, and there he lay. The doctors looked at him. The bullet had so lodged in his body that they said, "Look, there's no point trying to take it out." And sadly, he died. So Martin was, and justice was swift then. On the 4th of September 1843, Martin was put up for trial, and before Judge Montague. Now, it wasn't only bushranging, but now it was murder. Peter Winstanley killed Winstanley, and Martin was judged to be hanged. Now, this is a very mysterious thing, a strange thing. It became a point of law. No one really knows what that point of law was, and we can only assume that Montague considered, well, he didn't really have any intention of killing Peter Winstanley. He did it in self-defence. And because Winstanley was in civilian clothes, Martin didn't know that he was a constable. We believe that is possibly why there was a point of law. So Sir John Franklin had gone and was replaced by Governor Eardley Wilmot. So Montague went to Wilmot, and Wilmot was a very humane man. So he said, "Well, I really don't know what to do." So he sent a letter to London, and he asked, I think it was Lord Russell, to work out what is going to happen to Martin. Well, of course, in those days, that meant months and months going there, perhaps a couple of months of them to judge, and several months or 4 months to get back. So in the meantime, they put Martin in a cell. 10 months later, a ship arrives with the answer. And the answer was, well, you make the judgment, not us. So 10 months down the drain, but early Wilmot said, well, look, we'll commute the sentence. So this bushranger, this man who killed a constable, was free from the gallows, and instead they sent him to Norfolk Island. Now, Norfolk Island, there was Larry Kavanagh, his fellow comrade from the bush. Larry had shot himself accidentally in the leg, so he gave himself up, and like Martin, he was sent to Norfolk Island. Well, Norfolk Island, Martin was the model prisoner. He became a hat maker, and in the end he became a trusty convict. In fact, you could possibly say a constable on Norfolk Island. Now, on Norfolk Island at the time, there was a fellow called Rocky, William Westwood. He was another Tasmanian bushranger, and he had been brutalised by the system. He didn't care what happened to him. And Rocky led a revolution, well, let's say a mutiny at Norfolk Island. And he recruited Martin Cash's friend Larry Kavanagh to be part of the mutiny. And Rocky butchered 4 constables, murdered them. In the end, the mutiny was put down. But Larry did ask Martin Cash, his old friend from the bush, come join us in the mutiny. But wisely, Martin said no. So the mutiny was put down. Rocky and 25 others, which included Larry Kavanagh, were hanged. So after a period of time, well, I should have mentioned that on the island, Martin married Mary Bennett, who's 26 years his younger, and they were both released, came back to Hobart Town. They settled at the government farm where Martin worked. They had a son there, and then they moved out to Glenorchy. No, then Martin for some reason went to New Zealand, and there he was arrested for having a bawdy house. Well, we know what that is. And after 4 years he came back. It's a strange period. Why did he leave his wife and son in Tasmania? Why did he choose that profession? Why New Zealand? Mystery. His journal doesn't really say or touch that, you know. But the fact of the matter is the newspaper reports verify that he did that. So he came back to Tassie. He brought a farm out at Glenorchy, Montrose Road, 160 acres, which is 1 square mile, and he had a goat farm up there, he had a fruit farm. Tragically, his son died at 16 years of age, which with great remorse, it is said that Martin resorted to the drink much too often. And Martin used to drink at the Lord Rodney Inn down at Salamanca. It's no longer there. A lot of ex-convicts used to drink there. And he got ill. He was 77 at the time, 71 I think, at the time. And this was 1877, and he went to the Hobart Hospital and they said, no, sorry, there's no room for you. So he went back to Lord Rodney and a doctor came and said, no, you're okay. So Martin went back home, and there he died at his house in Montrose Road. And a wake was held in his honour at the Club Hotel in Glenorchy. His coffin was put on the bar for everyone to have a drink. And on the way to the cemetery at Colonial Bay, another wake was held at the Lord Rodney. So he ended up at Colonial Bay in 1877. There is a mistake on the inscription, I think it says 1878. So he's buried there with his son, his 16-year-old son, for all to see. Now his wife, Mary, because she was a lot younger than he, didn't die until 1891. And I just found out recently, and I thought, well, where she is buried? Well, she's buried in the same grave as Martin Cash and the son, so there's 3 in the grave. But oddly enough, there's nothing mentioned on the tombstone. So the relationship between Mary Bennett and Martin was very wild, if you like. You know, the police had to be called up to their house on several occasions because of the rows that were going. Now, what happened to Bessie Cash, Mrs. Cash, whose real name was Bessie or Betty Clifford? I don't know. No one has really found out what happened to Bessie. She seems to have fallen off the face of the earth. I've looked for her death, Joe Pratt's death, their marriage, etc. I surmise that they left Van Diemen's Land, and the track to find what happened to Bessie, I don't know. There's a lot more we could say about Martin Cash and indeed the capture, but that's a synopsis and a marvellous story.
Yes, a marvellous story indeed, Reg. Thank you so much for telling that to the Forgotten Tasmania audience. Please subscribe to this channel. The number of subscribers is one of the things that YouTube uses to decide whether it should show the video to new people, offer it up as a suggested video. And it's also important to get to 1,000 subscribers because that's the minimum level where YouTube starts to pay revenue to the collection. And of course that's the way that I'm intending to fund the ongoing storage costs and things of the collection. If you're able, there's also a Patreon campaign, so you can contribute money if you're able. If you go to our Patreon website, and that's listed in the description below as well. Look, I thank you for everything you do for me, and thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next episode.